Welcome to Candlewick Library. I'm Cheryl, and this is my June wrap-up. Right at the beginning of June, I finished Are My Kids on Track by Sissy Goff, and this is just talking about different emotional and social and spiritual milestones for your kids. In a lot of ways, I feel like this is better if you have younger kids. And I felt like the first half of this book was really strong, and then the second half I really didn't like that much. I didn't get much out of it. And in fact, a lot of the things that I got out of this book were more for myself and how I kind of relate to my kids at the ages they're at now versus things that they need to do. So I got some good information out of it. It wasn't anything earth-shattering. Since I knew we were going to the homeschool convention, I wanted to read a couple of the books that I had bought last year at the homeschool convention to see if I wanted to continue with the series and buy more books from those authors this year, since I knew that some of them would be there again. And one of those was The Cloak of Light from Chuck Black. This is the first book in the Wars of the Realm series. This is a hard book to review. It started out really slow. I felt like the first 100 pages of it were kind of pointless. I feel like they could have easily been told to us in a flashback or just in a couple of sentences about Drew's life throughout the rest of the book to kind of make sense of things. It felt like it was kind of showing us something that happened and then moving forward really fast, and then telling something that happened and then moving forward really fast. By 100 pages in, I was already not enjoying the book very much and kind of surprised that I didn't think the writing was as good as in another book I read by him. In this book, he ends up having an accident where he then can see these creatures, and he believes that they are maybe aliens or something like that. He's not a very religious boy. He and his friend are both kind of thinking that these are aliens or some kind of creature that is infiltrating Earth. He befriends a Christian girl, and I think that she is believing that they're demons that he's seeing. And then he also starts seeing another creature like those creatures that is fighting them. And so he just thinks that there's good and bad of the same species, and I think you're left as a reader to believe it's probably demons and angels. The hard part of this book for me is that I felt like it would get really good and I would get really engaged in it and actually be very interested in and kind of reading quickly to see what would happen, and then all of a sudden it kind of fall back into the way the first part of the book was. And so the whole book I was going back and forth between really liking it and not liking it as much. By the time I got to the end of the book, I decided that I really didn't care if I read the rest of the series or not. But then, a couple weeks later, when I was reading in my Bible, there was a scene that happened that reminded me of something in this book, and because of this book, I pictured it differently than I ever had when I read the Bible. And I thought that was really interesting, and so that made me kind of rethink it. I wouldn't say this is Chuck Black's strongest writing. I do think the story is interesting. I'm hoping that the rest of the books will get better. I do, at this point, think I will probably finish the series, or at least read the second one, but I didn't pick it up at the homeschool convention because I'm not in a rush to do so. So eventually, I will probably revisit this story. I also read Unveiling Grace by Lynn K. Wilder. This is another story of someone who left the Mormon Church, and her son left while he was on his mission, and then he kind of shared the things he learned with the rest of his family and his mission companions, and quite a few people ended up coming out of the Mormon Church and to a full embrace of Christianity from him. And so this was her side of the story. There were a lot of really good quotes in this and things that I really enjoyed. It was interesting to get her side of it and to get more information about what was happening in the family after reading Micah's book a few years ago. However, I didn't feel like she was as good of a writer as he was, and so I didn't enjoy this book as much as I enjoyed his. I think, related more to the way that it happened to him, but I still think it was a good book, and it's very interesting to like I said, to get more of the story. After that, I read the manga version of The Tale of Genji. I do not have that to show because I got rid of it after reading it. I finished it all over the course of probably 2 days, I think, and I will probably try to watch the live shows. I haven't been able to catch the two so far, but I probably will try to watch at least one of them before the end of the summer. I just really didn't like the story. I know my daughter was thinking about reading it as well, but I told her I did not think she would enjoy it. I wasn't quite sure if she should read it anyway, and so I just got rid of it. And Then after that, I had a really fun read. I reread Jurassic Park by Michael Crichton. This was for Emma, the Bookish Princess's book club. And it had been a long time since I've read this. I've read it, I think, at least twice before, maybe 3 times. But it had been a really long time since I've read it. And I've watched the movie multiple times in between. And so that was what was more fresh in my mind. I really enjoyed seeing the things that were different in the book than in the movie, because some of them I just didn't remember were different. I just love Michael Crichton's writings. We had the discussion for this book, and everybody seemed to have really enjoyed it that showed up for it. I know there were a few people in the group on Discord that said that the language and violence was too much for them. I would say that I actually think that the language is very tame for this kind of book. There wasn't a lot of traditional, what I would think of as strong language in it, but what there was a lot of is like Jesus and God's name being used blasphemously, and that does bother me. There wasn't a lot of other swearing. There was some, but not a ton. So for some people, this would definitely be too much swearing. For me, it wasn't in this kind of setting, in this kind of book. In other books, it would be, but for this one, it wasn't. The violence, I actually think, is really tame too. But again, that is a taste. For my younger daughter, it would definitely be too violent. For my older daughter, it wouldn't. Depending on if you read any language like that at all, or any violence at all, you might not like this. But I really enjoyed reading it again, and I definitely want to get to the Lost World sometime in the next couple of months. Just like in the movie, my favorite characters in the book and the movie are the same. It's Ian Malcolm and Alan Grant. And I found that just like in the movie, most of the best quotes come from Ian Malcolm. So that I wrote down quite a few quotes in my book. There's a lot said about how scientists believe they can just pretty much do anything, and if they can make it happen, they don't stop to think if they should make it happen. They don't stop to think about the fact that science can create something, but it can't tell you how to use it. There was one quote that said, "In the information society, nobody thinks. We expected to banish paper, but we actually banished thought." This came out in 1990, and it's still so applicable today. The next book was Raising Dragons by Brian Davis, and this was another book that I was wanting to get read before going to the convention. And the funniest thing about this book is that I started it one night, and I read probably 1 or 2 chapters of it, and I did not think I was going to finish it. I was not into it at all. Felt like it was very childish, which I think it's written to children, but it kind of feels more like a YA, but maybe it's a middle grade. I'm not sure what it's classified as. But I had no interest, put it down, and then I finished reading Jurassic Park, and then I decided to come back to this right before going to the convention. I decided I would give it a few more chapters before I completely DNF'd it. And I ended up really liking it. It was so crazy how different the rest of the story felt from the first couple of chapters. And this is about a boy who finds out that he is from a family of dragons. He's got dragon blood in him. It goes all the way back to King Arthur's time. And there are dragon slayers that are trying to find these descendants of dragons. I really decided I wasn't going to buy the whole series at once, so I only bought the second book at the convention. One of the funniest things about this book is I just never thought I'd be reading a book that had Christian Bible quoting dragons. So I feel like this book maybe doesn't even know if it's YA or middle grade, and it did kind of go back and forth sometimes, and it's definitely more on, I think, on the middle grade range for the writing and storytelling, but I did enjoy it, and I do think it's a really creative idea. So I am interested to see what happens in the next book and how I feel about the story after that. Pretty soon after we got back from the convention, I finished this Prayers for the Battlefield devotional by Heidi St. John. This was just a little devotional every day with a prayer and some scriptures that matched up, all about being a parent and preparing our children for the things that they're going to have to face in our world as adults. And this was wonderful. I loved it. Next, I read the next City Spies book. I believe this is book 4. It's City of the Dead by James Ponti. And in this one, as you can tell, they go to Egypt. I loved it. I felt like this was the best City Spies book so far. And maybe that's because of my interest in Egyptian things. I don't know. And it ended on quite a cliffhanger. So I really enjoyed this, and I'm still loving the series. Then I finished reading The Watchmen. This is the poetry of Lucy Maud Montgomery, and I mentioned on here that I'd read some of the poems in here, and I just finished the other ones I hadn't finished yet. I am not a huge poetry fan. It's just not my thing. Occasionally a poem will really speak to me, but for the most part, most poetry just kind of, it's pretty or it's nice, but it all kind of sounds the same to me. I'm not sure why I'm that way. So even with Lucy Maud Montgomery, I felt like almost every poem just felt like the same thing as before. And then there were a few that stuck out more. But yeah, I wasn't a huge fan. It was an easy read, quick. Now I can say I've read it. Then I finally got to the first book in the Harry Potter series. And again, I've read these multiple times. I don't even know how many times I've read Harry Potter. I've read them a lot by myself, and I've read them at least 2 or 3 times to my children. It's a story I know very well, but every time I read it, it's still magical to me. And it doesn't get old to me. At least it hasn't yet. And so I really loved it. I loved reading this version. I really wish they would come out with these anniversary editions for the whole series. Somebody make that happen. And then I read Vicar of Wakefield by Oliver Goldsmith. This was an interesting book too. I felt like I was surprised at how easy it was to read. And I did really enjoy the first couple of chapters. And I found that while in the first couple of chapters, nothing is really happening, I still was engaged because of his writing style. So I really enjoyed it. And then the drama started. While I still liked the book, it almost felt like too much. It was so dramatic. There were so many bad things that were happening one after the other. That was just really sad and really hard to read, I think. But also I don't know, it didn't feel very natural. And then the ending felt a little too good to be true. So I would say that I really enjoyed it, and I think this is really worth reading, but it wasn't my favorite classic ever. The last book I read for June was The Case Book of Sherlock Holmes by Arthur Conan Doyle. And this was a collection of short stories. This probably was right up there with the last book I read of his, where they're just not my favorite Sherlock Holmes stories, but I enjoyed it still. I think they're all really enjoyable to read. I had a couple of favorites. The Blanched Soldier, where there's a man who is trying to find his buddy from war, and it's mysterious circumstances where he can't find him, and the father is saying, oh yeah, he came home, but he went around the world. And so then he wonders, if he did that, why isn't he writing to me? So he's trying to find out what happened to him. And then Thor Bridge, where a woman is found shot on a bridge and trying to figure out who did it. And then The Lion's Mane, which also has somebody that appears to be murdered, and they're trying to figure out what happened to him. Those were probably my 3 favorite short stories in the book. There was only one that I didn't like. My least favorite was The Three Gables, and I just didn't like some of the words used in it. In the first story, there was a quote I wrote down: "Some people's affability is more deadly than the violence of coarser souls." I thought that was a really good quote and observation. So again, really enjoyed it. I am really enjoying reading all these Sherlock Holmes stories. They're so much fun. As for my challenges, how those fit into the challenges I'm doing, for the Read Your Bookshelf challenge, for the mod side, it was The Watchmen, a book of poetry. So I read The Watchmen. For the Doyle side, it was The Lost World, science fiction or fantasy. So I read Jurassic Park for that. And then, of course, the case book for Sherlock Holmes in my Sherlock Holmes reading. For Read Around the World-a-thon, it was translated to a language you would like to learn. So that was the Harry Potter book I used for that. The Buzzword-a-thon was repeating words. So I used City Spies for that. City Spies, City of the Dead. And then, of course, Jurassic Park also for the Bookish Princess Book Club. I was able to finish my Well-Read University challenge from the beginning of the year. I've got that all done now. And then finished the first book in Harry Potter, like I said. So I did really well on my challenges for June and had a really good reading month. I really enjoyed almost every book I read. Let me know if you've read any of those or what your favorite book you read in June was.